Okay, great. Well, we're going to go ahead and get started. Hi, everyone. Welcome back to those who went to the previous summer sessions. This is summer session 3, and the focus of this session is going to be on classical republicanism and natural rights philosophy. So kind of the Unit 1, Unit 6 type categories. This is the last summer session, but it will not be the last that you see of us. We will be helping throughout the year with your practices, and we'll also be putting on a testimony writing workshop, which will happen once the school year is more in full swing. So I know you've heard from our volunteers a lot if you've come to the first 2 sessions, but we have some new volunteers this session and also new folks joining. So we're going to just go ahead and reintroduce ourselves, the volunteers, and then we'll get started into our first activity of the day. So, hi everyone, I'm Sabrina McGraw. I am the president of Californians Advancing Civic Education. I am an alum of the program from 2013. I was in Unit 5, and I am now a practicing attorney in San Francisco doing litigation work. So I'm going to pass it to Zoe to introduce herself.
Hi, everyone. This is probably the first time you're seeing me. I am also an alum of the program. I graduated Amador in 2019, where I was Unit 1. I am currently in law school at NYU. I went to Cornell for undergrad, where I studied government and history, and I've been involved with CACE since I graduated. It's a great program, and you guys are in for a treat this summer. I'll pass it along to Elise.
Zoe. Hi, everyone. My name is Elise. I'm an alum of the program, Unit 3 in 2018. I now work for a local government nonprofit working with cities in North, South, and Central America, and I'm so excited to see you all today. I'll go ahead and pass it to Nathan.
Hey everybody. My name is Nathan. If you've been on any of the previous summer sessions, you've seen me. I am a Unit 1 alum from Irvington 2015, 2016. And I work for the Washington Metro.
And Patrick, why don't you introduce yourself?
I'll reintroduce myself. If you guys were at the first 2 summer sessions, I was also there. My name is Patrick. I'm a Unit 5 alum from Foothill last year, so 2024. And I'm studying civil engineering and business at UC Berkeley right now. Looking forward to helping you guys throughout the year.
All right, thanks everyone. Okay, so now we're going to get started on our first event for today, which is a awesome lecture on natural rights and classical republicanism philosophy. And with that, I will pass it over to Mari Wolgamuth, who was my We the People teacher, as well as an AP US history teacher. She's fantastic, and you're going to learn so much from her. So, Mari, take it away.
Thank you, Sabrina. Oh my gosh, I love to see all of these faces. And welcome to this program. This program is life-changing. Believe me, I would know because I've been working with the program for so long that I just know it's so worth it. So I'm sharing my screen and hopefully you can all see that. Good thumbs up. Yeah. We're seeing it. Awesome. Okay, so before you start like freaking out that Unit 1 is super boring because it tends to be one of the least favorite, but Zoe will tell you it's amazing. So I absolutely love Unit 1 because I love to talk about just thinking. I like to just like ponder things and I learn every single time I come in to judge any kind of unit, but Unit 1 is close to my heart because I just think it's so much fun to think and to ponder. So it's kind of nicknamed the philosopher's unit. And be aware that you should be hovering over your unmute because I am going to be calling on rando people. So I'm watching you. You can't just like not have your camera on and think that you can go and like grab yourself a cup of coffee. Okay, so here we are with the philosophical historical foundations of the American political system. Unit 1, question 1 is pretty much that? How were the founders' views about government influenced by both classical republicanism and natural rights philosophers? What are the essential differences between the two? And how did the differences appear in America's founding documents? So you're taking notes, I know, because you're all like amazing students. So jot down what is meant by founding documents. It tends to be any document before the Declaration of Independence. So can that be Thomas Paine's Common Sense? Yeah. Did I say okay. I don't know if I just said before the Constitution. You can use the Declaration of Independence. You can use Virginia Bill of Rights. You can use Virginia Declaration of Religious Liberty. You can use Articles of Confederation. State constitutions are great. Just know state constitutions and colonial charters. Oh, look at that. I put my thumbs up and I have fireworks. That is so fun. That the colonial charters kind of just turn into the state constitutions. They just kind of change some words, like let's get rid of the word king. So just know that there's a lot of similarities between those two. And Mayflower Compact, those are just some of those examples of what we mean by founding documents. So both traditions, both classical republicanism, natural rights, they're going to be concerned with human nature, what's the purpose of politics, what's good versus bad government. So you're going to kind of see, I know you already have access to this slide deck, so you can kind of already see that each of those types of philosophies are going to go through each of those. So we've got these two groups, some main ideas. All right, so our main idea for classical republicanism is polis, which is like city or state, like the people, and polteia. That is the supremacy of the state. Another main idea is civic virtue, like one that would give themselves to the government, like you are self-sacrificing, you have efficacy of like doing the right thing and getting involved in the government. And what motivates you is what's best for everyone. It's not what's best for me, it's what's best for the group, the whole. And they're very, classical republicanism is very centered on stability, justice, order. You can kind of see like military service, like compulsory military service would be kind of an example of a modern application of classical republicanism that's reflected in our government. Yeah, so write that down as an example that you can use in your Q&A. All right, the natural rights. It's more about like the individual person. Your public life and private life are very separate, and you kind of like your private life not to be interfered with by the public. The fundamental rights, kind of like, you know, our knee-jerk reaction when we hear natural rights is life, liberty, and property. And of course, the social contract. This idea of the social contract is that if we are like in a state of nature, we need to actually come together. And a way that we do that is forming a contract and saying, hey, government, you're going to do X, Y, Z, and we, the people, we're going to uphold that as long as, you know, you protect our rights. Okay, so that's kind of just like their main ideas roughly between the two. We're going to dive a little deeper into each one. So here are some example people that we glean information from classical republicanism: Plato, Aristotle, Cicero, St. Thomas. Aristotle, you're obviously going to be reading in your We the People textbook. Annotate that baby like nobody's business, I'm telling you. Same with Plato, he writes the Republic. Cicero is like a Stoic, ethical teacher. You can dive more into that as you get into your, what do they call the textbook? They're not chapters, they're lessons, right? In Unit 1. So classical republicanism on human nature. They believe that humans are polis animals, like we need each other, we need to communicate with each other. No hermits in classical republicanism. You also have individual uniqueness. Like every person in the society has something unique about themselves, and that's what they add to the whole, to the group. So if you are really good at reasoning or speaking well, maybe you're going to be a leader. If you are, very athletic and you can wield weapons, maybe you're going to be a soldier. So everyone in a classical Republican society is going to have something to contribute to the society. Obviously, there's also this requirement of education. So when we look at education in the colonies and in the early like the early states, like even into like maybe Jeffersonian democracy, you're going to see that states are trying to um, apply some public education because they know educating the young is very important. So one of those terms that you could slide in to this would be Republican motherhood, because Republican motherhood is that the moms would actually raise their children up in Republican values in order for especially their young sons to then grow up and then be, elected representatives. So the polis thrives, like the whole society thrives when citizens have good habits, virtues, and civic devotion. So you can see there is a lot of yeah, there's a lot of like uplift in a classical Republican philosophy. So that was the purpose of human nature. Now we're getting to politics. Like, what's the purpose of politics? To help humans achieve excellence and happiness. But there's a catch. It's probably not going to be really beneficial or successful in a large, very diverse population. So already you'd be like, kind of like the United States. Yeah, can't necessarily have a full-on classical Republican state. They're more successful in small, self-contained communities that are like communities. So I'll just throw out an example. Like when people say, what's wrong with public education today in the United States? And they'll say, in Sweden, they have blah, 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 blah. And, our first reaction would be like, Sweden. You're going with Sweden. I mean, why don't you just go with like Iceland and their education? Like they have a very homogeneous population. We do not in the United States. It's like apples and oranges. You can't just make a whole like cookie cutter of what might be successful in one country, successful in the United States. So let's go to good government. So what classical Republicans think good government is, again, self-contained small communities. There's a proper balance among members. There's not like a huge, hierarchy like social or economic strata. The primary focus is education. You have a wise, deliberative rule. So you definitely have an educated leader in a classical Republican state. The citizens are virtuous. They do what is right. They don't necessarily like fall into bad habits because that's not going to be what's good for, society. And of course, they have a very strong defense, and they probably have compulsory military service. So what's bad government? Bad government in classical republicanism is when one's passions are uncontrolled. So a lesson that you are probably going to see in your classroom in the next couple of weeks is a lesson on George Washington. He actually has like a whole list of what should be expected of citizens in the United States. And he actually warns against drug use. And I've always been floored by this. I'm like, GW actually like drug use back in like the late 18th century? That's just so bizarre to think that he actually like had that concern. But that's kind of that parallel to like, you need to not like be gluttonous and self-serving in a classical Republican state. You also have, for bad government under classical republicanism, self-interested rulers. If they're only ruling for themselves, that's not what's good for all of the community. Let me just see. Sometimes I get ahead of myself from my notes in my mouth. All right, so which principles of classical republicanism can I see in our founding documents? We got the Declaration of Independence, early state constitutions, and even the Constitution itself. So let me give you some examples. So here's where you want to take out those pens or pencils and kind of make some parallels here. So for uniformity, look at the religious, racial, and ethnic uniformity. Let's look at established churches in the early republic or even the colonies, right? So in the colonies, you have established churches, Massachusetts being Puritan. You have more Anglicans in the South, but all of the early states actually had established churches. That meant that tax dollars actually went to those churches. Also notice some of the colonies that settled for religious purposes. Pennsylvania, Massachusetts are pretty much your like go-tos for that. Notice also when we look at rigorous citizenship requirements, we do not have a citizenship requirement in our Constitution until the 14th Amendment. So all the states are kind of making their own decisions of like who can vote and what are the requirements for citizenship. And then looking at your civic virtue emphasized, another thing to consider is how early Americans viewed their identity. And most of them viewed their identity of their state. I am a Virginian. I am a Georgian. It wasn't, I'm an American. That whole idea has to come about. And what actually leads to that? Well, it's debatable. That's part of your critical thinking of like, oh, I'm going to say that that American identity actually happened with the Declaration of Independence, or no, it happened with the Articles of Confederation. So that's something that you can kind of pull into some examples again in Q&A or in your testimonies. So here are some examples of classical Republican influences from the Massachusetts Charter of 1780. So let me call on Amber Chi from Foothill. Can you read the Massachusetts section for us, please?
Yeah, sure. So, Massachusetts 1780, the happiness of a people and the good order and preservation of civil government essentially depend on piety, religion, and morality.
Okay, so thank you so much, Amber. That statement, when you read that, you can go, oh, that kind of looks more like classical republicanism than it does natural rights, right? And then an example from Pennsylvania. Let's look at Tanmay. Could you read the Pennsylvania 1776, please?
A frequent recurrence to fundamental principles and a firm adherence to justice, moderation, temperance, industry, and frugality are absolutely necessary to preserve the blessings of liberty and keep a government free.
Thank you so much, Tanmay. And can you see like the beginning part of that quote, justice, moderation, temperance, industry? You're like, oh my gosh, that's totally classical Republican. And then you see the blessings of liberty, and you're all, liberty? That kind of sounds like natural rights. But now you see how we can't just have one or the other. We have a blending of these two philosophies in our government. So examples that you could pull from the US Constitution that actually reflect classical republicanism could be in the preamble where it says, we the people, we, right? And even going on to the preamble of the more perfect union, common defense, general welfare, all of those phrases, classical Republican. So before we move into natural rights, I just wanted to kind of emphasize three aspects of classical republicanism. So get your pencils ready. Civil society, a civil society, civic virtue, and mixed government. Oh my God, I love these emoji things so much. Did you see the balloons? That's amazing. I love that. All right, so civil society, civic virtue, mixed government. That's like mixed constitution. It combines elements of democracy, aristocracy, and monarchy. All right, let's move on. How we doing on time? I'm doing so well. Let's go to natural rights. So natural rights, we've got Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau. These guys probably sound maybe a little more familiar. You're probably going back to, like, for classical republicanism, that probably took you back to world history. And then for natural rights, you're probably like, okay, that takes me back to world history, but probably also last year in US history, looking at Hobbes, Locke, and Rousseau. And, number one dude for United States government would be Locke, because he's Locke. All right, so we're looking at these individuals popping up in the timeline of in world history of the Enlightenment, 17th, 18th centuries. And their idea of human nature. So see what we're doing human nature, and then the politics, and then good and bad government. So we kind of do the same idea here. So for human nature, natural rights philosophers don't think we're necessarily social beings at birth. They do believe that some believe that people are naturally good. Like you look at a little baby and you're like, oh my gosh, how could anything bad be of this person? And then others will actually look at humans of like, no, y'all are bad. You're born into sin, and we got to do something about that. So kind of going along that route of that, like, humans can be pretty raunchy, is a state of nature. So a state of nature is also known as anarchy. So it means, like, if we have no government whatsoever, what are we going to do with ourselves? Well, natural rights believes that everyone has perfect freedom. So if everyone has perfect freedom, I have all the freedom to, I don't know, like, beat up Megan Leahy, right? That I can beat up Megan. She can also beat me up, but there's nothing stopping me from that because I'm in, like, perfect, freedom. Like, you're free to do whatever you want to do. So we can kind of see a problem with that. I'm sure Megan actually finds a problem with that, of like, I don't want to be beat up by her. So we need to form a government. So we're going to do that by forming a social contract, and we're going to have an agreement with the government that you're going to protect our rights, these rights, most likely life, liberty, property. But we're not giving you all the power, because we also want to have our individual freedoms as well. So we do need to be protected from one another. Megan definitely wants to be protected from me beating her up, right? And under the view of human nature, happiness and personal private matter, yeah, our happiness and our private sector is different than our public sector, right? There's kind of like that separation. So the purpose of politics. So the purpose that you would actually form a government is to preserve yourself, like self-preservation, to maintain order, protect rights and liberties, and have a common defense. And when we look at common defense, you're like, gosh, that kind of sounds like classical republicanism. So again, it's not like these two ideas are separate from one another. There's the blending that's going with them. Great. Okay, so good government. In a good government under natural rights philosophy, the people are sovereign. Sovereignty means power, right? So the people have the power. Every time I say that, I want to say, like, right? I mean, you have this power, and not individuals, the people. We consent to the government. We give them power. So if they start violating our rights, we can revolt. Ding, ding, ding. Natural rights philosophy, there is a right to revolution if you can see a trail of abuses. So the government is only ruling by consent. We give consent. What is an example of consenting to the Constitution? Ratification. Ratification is that consent that every state had to say, yes, we're going to ratify. Okay, it didn't take 13 out of 13 before the Constitution went into effect. It only took 9 out of the 13. But let me tell you, the other states finally came along. Oh, Rhode Island, you took a while, but you finally ratified that baby. All right, so under good government for natural rights, government obeys laws. Higher law. No one is above the law. No one, not even the president, not the Supreme Court. No one is above the law. Everyone has to be under the law. That's what we mean by having that higher law. Government provides what people need. We need security, but we also need our individual liberty. So Locke was really, Locke is the one that really emphasizes life, liberty, and property. When you unveil property, it can be kind of interesting because when we hear property, do you not just think of like real estate or I don't know, like things that you own? But property is also what you produce of your own work. So, like your work, right? It also means your ideas. So, think of like when we have copyright laws, like, holy cow, that's actually a Lockean idea of protecting our property. So, bad government. What is bad? And by the way, Sabrina, are you monitoring chat or should I pop into chat?
I'm monitoring chat.
Thank you. Okay. And just interrupt me if I need to go over anything. Okay. So bad government, it's not representative. So if there is a sector of our populace that lacks representation, maybe before women have the right to vote, maybe when this country was still practicing the institution of slavery, like those would be examples of bad government under natural rights philosophy. If the government is not responsive to our needs, you see, we have to communicate with the government. We have to communicate with them, our representatives of like, hey, we don't think this is a good idea, or hey, you should vote this way on this bill. Or if it violates our rights, yeah. Or if the government is not law abiding. So do you see similarities? That not law abiding, that goes right back to the same idea of bad government for classical republicanism. Okay, so we've got some quotes here. Hobbes is well known for his publication is the Leviathan. So his like anytime you see this picture, so if you had me for a push, you know that I'm really big into like, here's a document, what's the first thing you think about, right? Like what's a outside piece of evidence? So when you see this image, you're like, dude, that's Leviathan, Hobbes, I got it. So Hobbes believes that you're going to have a very strong ruler because a very powerful ruler is going to be the best to protect your rights. And so, as it says here, the supreme state with absolute dominion over all, absolute duty to protect the lives and subsistence of its constituency. Some of us might start to feel uncomfortable when we see that all powerful absolute dominion over. But when you think of, but they're there to protect your rights, you're like, yeah, but what happens if the government starts violating our rights? So you'll see kind of differences between these philosophers like Hobbes and Locke, Rousseau, and others. All right, so here we have Locke. Locke believes that, let me see if I'm getting ahead of myself. Okay. So primarily the state exists, like why do we have government? To enforce property and contract rights. I know it doesn't sound as like warm and fuzzy that we like to think about Locke because your experience with Locke has probably been his influence with Thomas Jefferson and the Declaration of Independence, life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness rather than property. But when you really start diving into Locke, he definitely wanted to preserve individual property rights and contract rights. It includes foreign enemies as well as domestic criminals. Locke also speaks of a right to revolution. So that's where we get that right to revolution, that if your government violates your rights without redress, and you can pave out, they did this, they did this, they did this, we asked them for this, we asked them for this, and they failed us, then you have a right to revolution. So when people use examples of like, well, did January 6th insurrection, was that just exercising their Lockean right to revolution? You'd say no, because those individuals had the protections of representative government. They had other means. They have freedom of speech without using violence. They have those rights preserved under our Constitution that the early colonists did not necessarily have under the British government. So then Rousseau is kind of in our top three natural rights philosophers. He's the one that really emphasizes consent. And so he also uses the idea of the social contract, that the people will give up some of their natural rights in order for protection from the government. And they would do that in forming a social contract. So, which principles of natural rights philosophy would I expect to find in American government? Using the Declaration of Independence or early state constitutions or the Constitution of the United States? Let me see where I am. Okay, yeah, let's go into early state constitutions. So in regards to early state constitutions, you have a contract of those states with their people. If you went before they were states and the colonial charters, those charters usually were with directly from the king if they're a royal charter, or they're through proprietary, kind of like William Penn was a proprietor. They're proprietor that also is then connected to the king. So there is consent. There are social contracts that we can actually like put our finger on for early state governments. Every state government had its own Bill of Rights before we have a federal Bill of Rights, you know, those amendments to the US Constitution. All of the state governments had rule of law. So we can actually kind of cherry pick from different state constitutions and again, colonial charters to give examples of these natural rights. Okay, so the Constitution, most of the state constitutions begin with their Bill of Rights. We know that our federal Constitution, the ending, the amendments, the changes to the Constitution are where our Bill of Rights are. But all the other state constitutions, they'll have them in the very beginning. So one Bill of Rights, one state's Bill of Rights that is heavily paralleled to the United States Bill of Rights, which is no surprising, like, hello, Madison, you're from Virginia, Virginia Bill of Rights, are the Virginia Bill of Rights here. So let's have, I already picked on Megan. I don't want to pick on you again. Let's see. Nathan Chang from Arcadia. Can you read our section 1 from the Virginia Bill of Rights, please?
Section 1, that all men are by nature equally free and independent and have certain inherent rights of which, when they enter into a state of society, they cannot by any compact deprive or divest their posterity, namely the enjoyment of life and liberty with the means of acquiring and possessing property and pursuing and obtaining happiness and safety.
Great. So before I let you go, what philosopher of natural rights would you see is probably most reflected in that quote? I'll give you multiple. Yeah, Locke. Yeah. Multiple choice would be Locke, Rousseau, or Hobbes. And why Locke?
Life and liberty and property, and
Boom,
pursuing
shakalaka.
obtaining
Yes.
happiness and safety.
Yes, you got it. A for the day. Thank you. All righty. So the US Constitution. So if you're questioning, I know your development of your 4-minute testimony has to be on the question that's given, which is early American documents, right? But in Q&A, you will probably be led to give more examples beyond like 1776. So here are some examples if you go beyond and you go into the Constitution, because Constitution 1787, you know, well, we have to get it ratified first. So natural rights theory, we can see it in the preamble. In the actual written constitution, because we have a written constitution, unwritten constitutions like Israel and Great Britain, they're just a collection of documents that they say this is our constitution. We actually want to write everything out. And I always kind of crack up because I have really good friends in Europe. So I remember talking to my German friends, and I cited our Constitution. I said, well, you know, in our First Amendment right, And my German friend was like, why are you citing your constitution? And I'm like, because that's what we do. Like we can actually cite it by like article and section and clause. And he was like, but why? You know it's there. Like, why do you need to cite it? It's like, because that's what Americans do. That's what being a good American is. And it was so funny for me to kind of like be called on it of like, yeah, I think it's completely normal. Like we have pocket constitutions that we hang on to. Like, yeah, we want to be able to be like, oh, let me check that constitutionality and like read the text itself. Boom. All right, so we also see examples in the separation of powers. So this is more like Montesquieu. If we look at Montesquieu's idea of you want to separate your legislative, judicial, executive branches, and then they'll have powers to check one another. So you have checks and balances. That's another example of natural rights. Legislative supremacy, another thing that Locke is well known for is saying like the most powerful branch is your legislature, which it actually ought to be because it's more representative, right, of what the people wanted. And then having checks on the government like election, impeachment, removal of a corrupt representative, that's also an example of natural rights. So, did they strike the right balance? James Monroe says Americans have always managed to weigh the celebration of individual with responsibility for the community, market striving with civic caring, the private sphere, and the public good. Now, one could be perhaps maybe a little critical of Monroe and say, yeah, that's easy for you to say because you're ruling under the era of good feelings where there's no political division, right? That everyone is of the same political party, like, yay, everything's great. We're so well balanced. Like, yeah, just wait for that. All righty. So here's kind of what we're going to think about. This is kind of like our next step. So I want you all kind of just think and ponder for a minute. Remember how I told you something I love about Unit 1 is the pondering. So I want you to think about Unit 1 in personal terms. Why do I behave the way that I do? Why do I walk around on this earth and behave the way I do? How much is my behavior influenced by fear of punishment as opposed to a sense of moral and public duty? Like I am making these decisions because it's what's best versus I'm making these decisions because I'm afraid of what will happen if I, do something wrong. And then how do my personal views relate to Unit 1 questions about classical republicanism and natural rights? Do you find yourself leaning towards more natural rights or looking at classical republicanism and going, no, there's really some good in that? Because I think as Americans, we tend to just go, oh, it's all about natural rights. And we discredit the classical republicanism of like how beautiful that creates balance within our political society. So here's the scenario. The scenario is there's this armored truck and it's filled with cash and like the doors are open and there's like, money bags right there. And you are instantly invisible. No one is going to know that you are there. Do you take the money? Do you take some money? Do you take all the money? Anything that you can hold? What is keeping you from taking the money? What is keeping you from not taking the money? Those are the kinds of like questions to ask yourself of that moral code, what is right, or no, I'm doing something for myself. So I'll end with this quick little story. When my kids were young, I was on my way to Kohl's in Livermore. We were about to take our first family cruise, and I needed to get, like dinner jackets or whatever for my boys. So I have 3 sons. And so we're all in the van, and I'm driving through the parking lot at Kohl's, and I see things like flying, like it looked like leaves in the parking lot. And I look and I'm like, oh my gosh, those are not leaves. that's money. Those are dollar bills. So I pull the car over, like I don't even park it. I'm such a bad mom. And two of my boys do not have a car seat. The youngest is still in a car seat. He's like, let me out, let me out, let me out. I hop out of the car. The other two older ones hop out of the car, and we're like grabbing money. It was like being in one of those like, prize things that they like blow the fan and people are trying to grab as many dollars as they can. And so I'm grabbing all this money, and I had this thought. Of like, if you keep following where the money's coming from, you're going to find the owner. And there was a moment that I was like, just stop right now and take all the money. It's just like flying through, the parking lot. But I kept going. Is that greed, right? I kept going. And then I found a wallet. And this men's wallet was so fatty, stuffed with bills. It was literally like making a ring. The wind was just picking up all of those bills. So I found that wallet. I got into the car. My boys and I were counting all the money. And there were like small bills, big bills, whatever. And it was like a few $100s. It was kind of like a specific now, like, $273. Like it was pretty specific. And I find the person's driver's license, and I pause because my boys were right there in the car. What are you gonna do, Mom? And I thought, if I was by myself, would I make the same decision, or do I have to like, have this moral code in front of my children? And I called the guy, and he said, "Oh my God, I lost like $273." I'm like, "I just found $273. I'm going to be at Kohl's for the next half hour if you want to come by." And he came in. I know you're probably thinking, drug money? And I just said, no, gambling. I'm sure he just like won in a poker game. I'm not going to think bad things about this person. But think of all those points of making a decision based on morality. Do I keep following the money? Do I then call the person who I can plainly see the money came from? Do I offer to give it back? Do I say how much it is? Do I take any for myself? Do I judge that person? Did they walk in with a wife beater on? Yes. Did I hand over all the money? Absolutely. Did he give me a 20 as a finding fee? Yeah, sure. Woo, right? But those are kind of the questions. And that's what I just absolutely love about Unit 1, is that Unit 1 is all full of those like moral questions and pondering. And that is what I will leave you with, pondering about government. Thank you.
Thank you so much. That was wonderful. I haven't had any questions through the chat, but I wanted to make sure everyone had an opportunity to send questions. You can just send it to the group, to me, or to Mari directly. Or sorry, Mrs. Wogelman. Any questions? I'll give everyone like 30 seconds because sometimes it takes some typing. Or feel free to unmute and just ask your question.
I'll go ahead and ask a question if that, oh, there's an actual question in the chat. Definitely do that one first.
Great. So the question is, I wonder if this idea of civic virtue is different in Eastern cultures. Do you have any thoughts on that? I believe you're on mute, Ms. Woldemuth.
Oh, you want me to answer that? I thought it was like up to the group. I think that is a really cool angle to take, is looking at like Buddhism. Of course, my gut is to go to religious thought, but this is more political thought. So then you would have to look at like political ideas that were shaped in Eastern cultures versus Western Civ. Okay, so I see, wondering what your thoughts on Rousseau's idea of human nature relating to good government. I believe he thought all humans are inherently good. Yes, so it is partly your homework to find out, do these philosophers believe that humans are born good versus humans are born, and I hate to say born bad, it's more a religious thought. It's more of original sin. So you're going to see that we don't have just purely political thoughts. All of these political ideas are going to be influenced by religion. And because we're focused on Western civilization, it's going to be influenced by Christian ideology. And so the Christian ideology or even Jewish ideology is that we are perhaps born into sin, that like God made humans and we are in a fallen world, right? And so it's up to us to, try to do the best thing we can in order not to fall more into sin. So someone like Locke did believe in original sin, but it's not going to be as heavy of an influence on his political philosophy, being like Christian philosophy, as one might suspect. So in looking at Rousseau's belief that humans are good, you can kind of see that that goes along with individual rights, that we're going to do we're going to do the right thing by giving up some of our rights to a leader, to a government. And how does Locke's prerogative affect our Constitution? Okay, do you mean Locke's prerogative of life, liberty, and property? Maybe Harjap, if I'm looking at... Oh, that was directly to me, so no one else can see. Okay. Locke's prerogative affect our Constitution. I don't know if you wanted to clarify, Harshap, on what you mean. Do you mean life, liberty, and property? Because the easiest connection we'll make is, oh, there, those balloons again. The easiest connection we'll make is Thomas Jefferson changing property to pursuit of happiness. So I can speak to like that change, and that is one that is perhaps more attainable for more people because everyone has a different interpretation of what happiness means to them. So a pursuit of happiness is like a journey versus property could be something stagnant. So Thomas Jefferson, in a way, gives us hope of a future when he changes that property to pursuit of happiness. His belief that the executive can go against the law in the interest of the public. So I don't necessarily think Locke would say your leader can go against the law. Locke is still going to believe in higher law. No one is above it. And the checks come from the people. So the people have to keep the government in check. So if the leader, like George III, King George III, if he is repeatedly violating individual rights, and here's the catch, you have actually asked for a redress of grievances, and the colonists did several times have petitions for redress of grievances, and then they were done. That's why they would revolt. They didn't just instantly revolt in, 1763. It took a while, right? Because there was a train of abuses. So what we also have to consider is Locke is writing in 1689-ish, and our founding is happening about 100 years later. So these ideas have been percolating, and it's not like we're going directly to the source and saying, hey, John Locke, what do you think about the British colonies revolting? Yeah. So Locke would likely disagree with the outcome of Trump versus US. Well, that is a great way of bringing these ideas. You see, they are not antiquated ideas. They can still be applied to today. And that is just like one of a follow-up question that you would be faced with is like, run with it. Would you say that natural rights philosophers would disagree with Trump versus US, and why? Yeah. All right. Any other questions?
One thing I just wanted to remind everyone is that these philosophies are different, but they can have overlap, and they often do. It's just like a matter of like how you're looking at it. So one of my favorite philosophers that I love to think about is John Rawls, who is not one of the founding philosophers, but he has this idea of kind of mixing personal self-interest with the good of the people, with his idea of the first position, the veil of ignorance. So it's this hypothetical. Imagine that everyone is in the same position. We're in this like, world looking down, and everyone has to decide. No one has like their gender assigned or their like their what their future is going to look like in this world. So you're in this veil of ignorance, this idea that no one knows who they're going to be once the world starts. And at that point, as a society, you have to decide what society is going to look like. And so in that position, you can be in the best position when the world starts, or you could be in the worst possible position. How do you make a government in that position, in that light, knowing that you could be in the worst position or the best? And the idea is that the self-interested person is going to decide to make the bare minimum, the worst position, at a certain level to make sure that the world looks like in a place that they could live with. And so I think like that's a really good way to kind of look at how both of these philosophies interact, because you're making a society that's good for everyone in like the classical republicanism style, but you're also using that self-interest that comes with natural rights. You're saying everyone should have a minimum amount. So I encourage you to look beyond just the philosophers that influenced the founding when you're looking at these questions, because later philosophers also have really interesting ways to look at it. I did have another question come through. It says, is Unit 1 just a lot of thinking?
As one of the resident Unit 1 alums, yeah, it's a lot of thinking and arguing, and honestly, it's a lot of fun. Uh, if you can handle that. I know my unit, we all sat around and just started naming off philosophers, and that like joke about like, oh yeah, guys will sit around and name random sports figures forever. That was my unit with philosophers. We just spent hours on hours just going Thomas Aquinas, Immanuel Kant, Friedrich Nietzsche, like back and forth. And that was basically us. But it differs depending on who you are.
All right, I don't have any more questions coming through the chat on my end.
So I see McKenna from Foothill asks a really great question about the separation of church and state. And even though our founding started with the colonies, that many of them were very religious, what we note like baseline is everyone coming over to the colonies, their primary objective was economic. Religion might have come for the ride. Our founders, even like George Washington, Thomas Jefferson, there are writings that you can find that they appreciate not only the separation of church and state with the belief that the government should not be involved in religion and religion should not be involved in government, but you'll see the beginning of what will turn into the Establishment Clause and the Free Exercise Clause of the First Amendment. And the best place to look at that is Jefferson's Declaration of Religious Liberty. And then even going further back, again, if you had me last year, I'm a huge fan of Roger Williams and the founder of Rhode Island, because his soul consciousness, there's a beautiful quote of his that he said, if the government compels you to pay taxes to a religion that you don't agree with, I'm paraphrasing, by the way, that violates your soul conscience, because you have a different, like you should have such perfect liberty to believe whatever you want, if it's religious or political, whatever, that if the government forces you to pay taxes that go towards a religion that you do not believe in, that is a violation. And that religion can only be propagated by like discussion and free will. So we can see even from the 1600s, there are examples of that beginning of the separation of church and state. And as McKenna wrote in the chat, what does that mean about a religious right? And if you're asking me personally, I'm very wary of that, because yes, we can see some influence of Christian values in the foundation of our government, but one, it's not religious. It could be just civic religion, right? It could be, oh, there's the thumb. I love these little emojis. And the second thing is, should we interpret our law today based on what the founders set up? That's a question for you to answer, because some people are originalist and they'll say, yes, we need to believe what the founder said. And others will say, no, we need to interpret it to our needs today. Because obviously, our society in the 21st century is vastly different than it was in the late 18th, early 19th century. So thanks for asking that, McKenna. Okay, so Ernest, your question is a pretty broad question. Ways modern America state oh, you think like America's laws and federal laws and state laws different than Locke's idea? Yeah, that's probably a little too big to really go into, like, a 1 minute, 90-second response, but that is definitely, you've got the juices flowing that then you can go look at examples at state law or federal law and apply it to these philosophies.
Agreed. I think that's exactly the kind of question that you could get in a Q&A in response to really any of the units. And so it's great that you're thinking about that, and we'll let you do the research to figure out what a good answer to that is. But it's great that you're thinking of that. So we're a little bit over time, but that was a wonderful discussion. Thank you so much, Mari, and really enjoyed that. I love getting the refresher every year on this. It's a great concept. So we're going to go on for a 10-minute break, and then we will resume. So everyone should be back here at 11:10. All right, welcome back, everyone. Hopefully people are coming back. It's always funny with Zoom because nothing changes, but welcome back. So we're gonna get going on our types of evidence. So this is gonna be an overview of the kinds of evidence that you can use in your testimonies and Q&A. So with that, I'll hand it over to Elise. Elise, are you able to share your screen? Do you want me to do it for you?
Yeah, I actually put it in deck form if that's fine with you.
Totally fine.
I assume so, but I just wanted to check.
Awesome. Thanks.
Awesome. Well, I think something lovely about Comp Civics, or We the People, whatever you call it, is that you get to use a lot of different types of evidence. And even if you're in a specific unit, like Unit 1, which people always refer to as the philosophy unit, you are expected to be able to talk about a broad range of different types of evidence. And similarly, when we're thinking about like a Unit 3, for example, which I was in, you're similarly still expected to be able to reference philosophy or the founders in your Q&A or in your testimony. So this presentation is just going to quickly go through what the different types of evidence there are. It won't touch on everything. If you have questions, please unmute, put in the chat, whatever works best for you. And Sabrina, if I'm going over time, just like interrupt me. That is totally fine. And I'm happy to keep moving. But we'll go ahead and get started with philosophy, because I think it's the easiest to jump into, because Ms. Wolgemuth did such a great job kind of giving a briefer on what the different types of philosophy that we most often talk about in We the People, but not every type. So philosophy refers to a specific reference to a philosopher's text, influence, or actions in life. What this can look like most often is talking about a potential framer or historical figure in US history, and then referencing how they were influenced by past philosophers or current modern day philosophers that influenced their decision making. This requires knowing the context of the philosophical idea and being able to defend that idea into the future. So being able to talk about John Locke, you're going to want to know what was the Enlightenment period, what was going on in the Enlightenment period that framed how John Locke viewed and saw the world. Similarly, I think more and more we're hearing references great references to 20th century philosophers. So for example, Hannah Arendt is a great female philosopher that can be referenced in We the People. She was writing and thinking in the time of World War II and how that impacted her totalitarianism, views of authoritarianism, definitely impacted how she viewed things. I think in our modern day and age, she might be very relevant to talk about still today. There's many different philosophers you can pull from. You can pull from Socrates, you can pull from Aristotle, you can pull from Hannah Arendt. I think it's important to call out that often Unit 1 or philosophy in general is kind of viewed as like the old white man philosophy, but I really encourage all of you as you start to get started with your testimony and Q&A to think about other philosophers. There's so many 20th century philosophers that we can pull from. Sabrina mentioned John Rawls. You can pull from Black philosophers from the era of the Harlem Renaissance or the Civil Rights Movement. So there's so many great opportunities to pull from philosophers no matter what unit you're in. The second type of evidence you're going to want to pull from is historical events and examples. Specific historical events can give great opportunities to connect ideas or analysis you have and applying it to a historical event. So for example, in Unit 3, you're going to talk about what is the importance of having the First Amendment protections to advance voting rights. And a great example of that will be often referenced is the Civil Rights Movement and how leaders used their First Amendment rights and their protections to be able to assembly and protest in order to further their movement towards gaining protections of their right to vote. So these are examples that best justify your argument, as well as those that offer the greatest threat of being used in a counter argument. There's so many historical events and examples to choose from. I'm not going to list all of them, but these can be events that happened before the ratification of the Constitution. So if you're in Unit 2, you will be referencing Shays' Rebellion a lot. They can be more recent, such as I said before, the Civil Rights Movement, and even historical events that didn't happen in the United States, but may be important context or reference that you can refer back to. A lot of what you're going to be doing in We the People is thinking about laws, actions, and policies. This is a very broad ranging category that can touch on a lot of different important key pieces of evidence that you can use in your analysis to further your point. So this could be a specific piece of legislation, a set of policies, or direct action taken by the US federal government, or another power. So this could be the state and local actions, and it can also be actions taken in other countries or regions that still may impact or have influence on what's happening in the United States. A great example of this that a lot of Unit 4, Unit 3, Unit 6, Unit 2, Unit 1 is going to touch on is the War Powers Act of 1973. This was an act taken by by Congress in order to attempt to limit the actions of the president. What's great about these laws, actions, policies is they don't just have immediate impact, they also have impact in today. So touching on what does the War Powers mean in the 21st century? How did the War Powers Act or Congress impact how we view the executive branch, whether we can limit the executive branch, are all questions that might come up. So even though you might be referencing a specific law, these specific laws can have important context that you can bring into today with your analysis as well. And so the next is current events. When I was in We the People, I had a teacher who would just send us articles. Every single day, we would get a different article. It's a great practice to start reading the news when you're in We the People, because it really is relevant to to every single one of your units and every single one of your questions. There are current events going on, that have been impacted by the questions you're addressing or impact how we view the questions you're addressing. So I think we're all very aware of what's going on with the 2024 presidential election. I expect the 2024 presidential election will continue to come up as you continue to grapple with your issues that come up in We the People. And so just a recommendation overall to check out the news, have the news app downloaded on your phone, watch NPR if you can, or CNN. Just like keeping up to date is really helpful to kind of have those like unique or up to date knowledge of the topics you're talking about. Something to flag is that it's recommended to use your own local events. So what is happening in Pleasanton, what is happening in the Bay Area, what's happening in Arcadia or Southern California. These are all ways that you can connect what these questions that you're addressing in We the People, how it's being impacted in your own local communities as well. It's recommended to focus first on your local events before using local events from other jurisdictions. That being said, I definitely think there are many relevant events that are happening in local communities throughout the United States that can be impacted or impactful in how you're having conversations. And then especially for Unit 5 and Unit 3, precedent and what the Supreme Court says is incredibly relevant to what you're discussing. Supreme Court cases provide evidence, quotes, historical background, and also knowledge about what different sides believe on an issue. Precedent, to be very specific, is a Supreme Court case that has withstood the test of time and has a legacy behind it. You're going to be, every unit can discuss a Supreme Court precedent and how it relates to your subject. So some examples of this are Brown v. Board of Education in 1954 is something that will come up a lot for Unit 3, a lot for Unit 6. And then kind of tying the precedent we were talking about to the current events we were talking about before, the US Supreme Court is always moving, and I think especially now, changes to precedent are occurring. So being able to speak knowledgeably to what the Supreme Court is doing is very important. So Dobbs v. Jackson Women's Health Organization from 2 years ago at this point will be probably very relevant to a lot of the discussions you're having about what is the role of the Supreme Court, what is the role of federalism. So lots of different ways you can handle and approach how you're applying Supreme Court precedent to the questions that you're addressing and analyzing. And then statistics can be very powerful to hammer home a point. So a current statistic or a trend over time can act as evidence in testimony that could be very effective in making your point. So an example I have up here, I think there's more examples in the handout, but since Dobbs, 22 states have banned abortion or restricted the procedure earlier in pregnancy than the standards set out by Roe v. Wade. This is a piece of evidence that you can use to talk about how states have responded to changes in Supreme Court precedent. This is ways you can talk about what it means to have individual rights and how governments are responding to changes and how individual rights are being viewed by the Supreme Court. So statistics are very great ways to make reference to build your argument as a whole. I'll also just flag here that when we're thinking about statistics, it's also helpful to think about what the source is for this statistic. When you start going into state competitions, and if you are lucky, national competitions, having who your source is very important in order to make a convincing argument. So I can stand here and say that, like, there have been 7,000 cases of voter fraud in 2020, which is A, probably not true, and B, if you don't have who your source is to back it up, then it's not as strong of an argument. And then the last piece of evidence that you can pull from is a personal story or anecdote. I think this is probably one of the more difficult ones to do well, but when you're able to do a personal story well, then it can be very effective. I think the importance of a personal story is that it can be used in a way to back up an argument or bring what is happening at a very high level at the federal government and discussing how that's impacting people in a very personal way. There's always like these sayings about like policy is personal, politics is personal, but it is true. And it is helpful when you're in We the People, especially in Q&A, when possible, to bring up how these actions, what the framers discussed in the 1700s is impacting you today. There's a couple do's and don'ts, and you'll find your groove as you start going. But the first is that when personal stories are effective, it's an anecdote that connects to ideas that are directly in the testimony. You don't want to just start rambling off about how you just got a new job and you're really excited about it and you're going to have to pay taxes and that sucks. That's not an effective or impactful personal story or anecdote. What could be a interesting personal story or anecdote is talking about your personal experience with civic education, your personal experience, if it's applicable as an immigrant or a child of an immigrant, ways that connect, but it's important that they connect directly to the question itself. So those are I think it's 7 or 8 pieces of evidence. I will go ahead and stop sharing my screen. If there are any questions, feel free to put them in the chat or go off mute. And if not, I'm happy to pass the torch.
And one thing I'll say is that we're putting together a list of good sources for a lot of different types of evidence, which we will circulate to your teachers and your emails so that you can have it once you start doing all the research of places we found are helpful to look at. So seeing none right now, I'm going to move on to the next section, which kind of overlaps somewhat with this, but so we can kind of have questions about everything if things came up in the meantime. So I'm going to be talking about the We the People tips and tricks. And I do see a question that came through. I'm going to answer it after I get through this. So this is a handout. Can everyone see this? Okay, great. So this is kind of the several tips and tricks for a successful We the People team. This was put together by CACE folks who have been doing this program for many, many years. And so I'm going to just talk about a few. Some things Elise already brought up, which I think is great. So number 1 is consume at least 3 to 4 sources of news and current events each day. This talks about websites, blogs, newspapers, radio, podcasts, television programs. That's a lot. But one thing I really want to highlight is the use of podcasts. We the People is actually when I started getting into podcasts. So because to the extent you aren't, podcasts are available for free online, as well as on various apps if you have a smartphone, which includes just like the Apple podcasts, and also Spotify has podcasts as well. And I wanted to highlight a few that can really help you get into practice, because I think consuming news and current events every day is essential for this program, because most of the time current events are exactly what judges are drawing from in Q&A. And if you don't know what's going on, then you're going to be at a severe disadvantage compared to folks who are doing it. And it's good to start now to get in the habit. And so the best thing for me is podcasts, because I'm able to just consume each day. I know. So write this down. It'll be included in the list we distribute, but the best podcasts I think to just get general news sources every day are Up First by NPR. That's usually a 15-minute a day podcast. So I think it's like a great like short size. I listen to it when I get ready in the morning. And so I'm not like wasting time, or when I'm on a bus or whatever going to school. Well, when I was in school. And then the other two I'd recommend for this is The Daily, which is by the New York Times, and Post Reports, which is by the Washington Post. Both of these are about 30 minutes. If you're like me and you listen to things 2 times speed, it's also 15 minutes. But I would recommend checking out one of those. It's fine if you don't end up liking them, but I think that's the best way to get into the habit of things as you go forward. So next is outline your testimonies before you write them. I think this is really essential, especially when you're starting out, because an outline will make sure that you answer all parts of the question. As we've talked about in other sessions, there is for each question set for each unit, there is a overarching question and then 2 sub-questions. And it is so frequent that people get so caught up in answering the overarching question that they forget to answer one of the other 2. And so outlining is the best way to ensure that you're answering all the questions, and it can help you rearrange sections to the extent you think things aren't flowing right, or things aren't making sense. And so highly recommend doing that. Next here is debate your positions on issues with your teammates before, during, and after you write your testimonies. I think this is also essential. I think all these on the list are pretty essential. But I think this is important because sometimes you get like a writing assignment and you're like, okay, we're just gonna write whatever is the easiest and just get it over with. But this testimony writing is something you're going to rewrite again and again. And it's really important that your team, your unit, has thought really carefully about your answers and all of the possible responses that judges might have to it. And the best way to flesh out all these issues is to talk with your teammates at every stage of the process to ensure that you're really being thoughtful and responding to things you disagree with. And one thing to highlight is we often get, in response to the testimonies, a division among the unit where they disagree about a specific point. And so you'll say, these 2 unit mates think this, while these 2 unit mates think that. That is okay and totally welcome in pretty much every situation. And actually, it's really great to have that kind of dynamic, because then it ensures that you're addressing both sides of the argument, because some people can go either way. It's not essential to disagree, especially if everyone's truly on board, but to the extent you can find some disagreement, it's really great in testimony to flush it out and leads to a really fun and engaging Q&A oftentimes. Next, we have get feedback on your testimonies and Q&As from as many people as you can. So this is going to be something that might take some getting used to, because you're going to be putting yourself out there again and again every time you do a practice. But it really is essential for people to give you feedback, because oftentimes written items can sound different. They can come off across as different or be more confusing when you're reading it. So practicing reading it and having people listen to make sure it makes sense is essential. And also other people from different perspectives can give you background and feedback about things that you might be missing. Sometimes you're so focused on answering a question or so in the weeds on research that you might be missing something more obvious that needs to be included in your testimony. So it's really important you get that. Q&As, feedback is even more important. That's the thing that you're going to be practicing throughout the year. But both of these things, We the People CACE can help with, because we will be putting a practice on with your schools to the extent your schools request it at every stage of the competition. So that's like part of our bread and butter of this program, is giving those kinds of practices. You're going to be doing tons of practices within your schools and in the classroom as well. Next is ask for help and use your available resources. So this is also another plug for CACE. As I had mentioned before, once your school gets started and you're assigned into units, the schools that permit us to use Discord, we will set up a Discord channel for your schools and get that going. And that's a great place to ask us questions directly, for us to share news articles we come across that we think will be helpful to your teams, that sort of thing. great place for us to ask questions, but to the extent your schools don't permit Discord, you can always email us as well, and we can answer those questions there. The same thing. So don't be afraid to reach out to us. This is literally why we're here, to help with this program. And so please, please ask questions of us. You can also use alumni from your schools. They're going to be great resources, especially recent alumni, to the extent they're willing to put you out there. The recent alumni know all the information right off the bat, right off the top of their head, because they just came out of the program. And so highly recommend reaching out to them as well. I've yet to be in a situation where someone said no. So don't be afraid to put yourself out there. And if you need some brainstorming with who to reach out to, you're not sure, always feel free to reach out to me, Sabrina at civiceducation.org. And I can help kind of point you in the right direction as well. Next is good teams can identify problems. Great teams will identify solutions. So I think this is really important to remember, because it's really, you could debate all day about something being bad, or, are like trying to propose saying that, our education system is bad in the United States. But it's a whole other thing to come up with a team for solutions for how to make it work. And those are the kinds of Q&As that end up being a lot more productive and interesting to hear, rather than some groups just identifying problems. Finding solutions is oftentimes the hardest part of We the People, because you're like, who am I to offer a solution to a problem that our government is facing? But thinking creatively and just putting yourself out there doesn't have to be like a perfect solution, but offering solutions is a really great way to get engaged in the program and to score high on your testimony and Q&A. So I recommend always, when you take a position on identifying a problem, offering a solution as well. Next, this kind of goes into something that I already mentioned, which is practice arguing the other side of every position that you take, especially to the extent your group doesn't disagree on one of the ideas you're putting forward in testimony. Just having conversations with each other about all the different ways that a judge could push you in the other direction and what your response is going to be there. Sometimes that might mean acknowledging that the other side is right to some extent, but explaining why you think your position ultimately carries the day. So keeping that in mind, having tons of conversations about that is going to be what makes your Q&A really helpful. I'll also say having these conversations with your unit throughout the year is going to be really helpful for strategy in Q&A. I know my unit had so many conversations over and over again, and it was really helpful because when it came to Q&A, we already knew what each other were going to say in response to these questions, because we had already talked about a lot of these issues. So we could bang out 4 different answers covering different areas because we had already talked with each other about these issues. So don't underestimate that as being part of the process. Next, work with other units in your class. I think we've said this already in the first 2 sessions, but knowing other units' content is essential for making sure your answers are complete. For instance, Unit 5 might think, oh, I only need to know cases and like what the Bill of Rights are, and I'm done. But knowing all the philosophical undertones, especially like Locke and the relationship of natural rights, understanding a bunch of different ways that the federal structure of government can impact those rights, your answer is going to be more complete and show diversity of information compared to other units that are really putting their blinders on and just listening and doing their own research for their units. The easiest way to work with other units in your class is to just listen to their presentations and the evidence that they give. That's like the least amount of work to do, just to listen and be engaged. And that can help you incorporate those ideas into your own presentations and question and answer period. Lastly, spend non-We the People related time with your unit. You're going to be spending a lot of time with these folks and you need to get to know them. And so it's really important that you spend time together in less stressful situations as well, so that you can be a bit more cohesive and show that you can interact with each other. It'll also just make all the long hours doing the work a lot more fun. So highly recommend doing that. Now with that was a lot of information. I'm going to see if any questions came up, and these can be questions about the types of evidence that Elise presented on as well. Looks like I'm getting, okay, here's one question. I'm a little confused as to how and when you would use a personal anecdote or story. Elise, do you want to take that one?
Yeah, I can go ahead and take it. I'll say, and I should have said this earlier, the personal anecdote and story is the type of evidence that will be used the least in comp civics or We the People. And I think you only want to use it when it really adds to the argument you're making. So I'm trying to think of a good example. An example that came up for Unit 6 a lot when our Unit 6 had questions on immigration was a student talking about their family's own experience and like the arduous application process for to become a naturalized citizen, and being able to speak to like both the length of it and also like how that impacted their family, very briefly when they were able to speak to that was very effective to bring like the high level to a very personal. You're not going to see personal stories used every testimony and Q&A, and you're not expected to for sure. But when there are times where you can really hammer home a point by making it more personal, I think that's when we see it come up the most.
Yeah, and there are other situations that might come up as you become more politically aware in your community. For instance, I know that our school during my year introduced drug sniffing dogs to campus. And so one of our personal anecdotes was actually talking about how it made us kind of feel to have that presence on campus. And that kind of spoke to the reasons why we have the Fourth Amendment in the first place, preventing unreasonable search and seizure and talking about that. So they don't necessarily have to be about your personal experience, like with your family. It could be something about how you're interacting. I know I've also heard like folks go to their local council meetings to see like what's being talked about and sort of talking their personal experience that way too. But yeah, I wouldn't use that as like a primary source. It's really only if you think of something that would work that you would use that situation. I have one question was, would you include the names of the podcast in the chat? Yes, we're going to prepare a one-page sheet that has kind of good sources in a bunch of different areas, and there will be a podcast section, which we will talk about that. So I'll distribute that list to your teachers and also to all the emails that I have from the signups for the summer sessions. There's one question is, what are good ways of trying to find different sides of our position and identifying counter arguments? Feel free to chime in, anyone, but my instinct is to say there's not like a good strategy way. I would say like part of it is gonna just be talking with each other about like your thoughts and things that you come up with. A lot of it's gonna be being creative. But the other thing I would say is try and research what smart people who study this, scholars, have had to say on this topic, because oftentimes you'll get both sides from that, and you'll also be able to rely on those sources to support your opinions when you're addressing counter arguments. Anyone else have any thoughts on that one?
Yeah, something that my unit would do, especially because we were Unit 1 and it was very philosophy based, was we would literally take the position that we felt most comfortable with and then immediately say, okay, I'm gonna take the other position. Like, one of the big ones that we had was, were the protests in the wake of Black Lives Matter 2015 justified? And a lot of us said yes. And so 30 minutes later, we would say, well, no. And here's why: they didn't establish X, Y, and Z and trace a petition of redress or whatever. And like sometimes it's just that easy. Like, just sit down, say, okay, whatever position I took, I'm now the opposite. And you spend however long it takes figuring out why somebody would believe that. Um, and back it up with evidence, and there's your counter argument and other angles of attack, angles of bolstering your own position that you will end up taking during competition.
Awesome. So I got another question, which I love, which is, so We the People is like family, right? Absolutely. that they will be, your unit mates will become your family as part of this program, just by the sheer amount of time you have to spend with them, and also your entire team. And it's really important that you're thinking about family in this way, because I think that's the best way to get the most out of this program and to be the most successful. So I don't have any other questions. So last call for questions. Anyone else receive questions from volunteers? We are going to be going into breakout rooms to discussing what is the most important duty of citizenship and what is the least important duty and why. So you're going to go into your groups. There's going to be a volunteer in each one to sort of facilitate discussion. And then we will come back and we will vote on the most important duty and the least important duty. So I'm going to open the breakout rooms now, pause the recording, and we are going to be in the session until until 11:55, and then we'll come back for the last 5 minutes to do the vote. Okay, let's go. For the recording, we are voting on the most important duty. The options are voting, civic education, being informed, protest, dissenting, freedom of speech, jury duty, paying taxes, abiding laws, and political volunteering. And then our least important duty that we are voting on is voting, paying taxes, following laws, military service, jury duty, acts of patriotism like displaying the flag or memorizing the Pledge of Allegiance. And we are almost done with the votes. Got a couple more people that need to vote. I think 3. I am actually waiting for everyone to vote. Got 2 more people. I believe in you. Yeah, we need voter turnout is critical, as Zoe says. You don't want those 2 people giving up your ability. I like it. They aren't voting in protest because it's the least important civic duty. Yeah, I will count the remaining now 3 people I'm going to put towards voting as the least important. So, okay. I'm ending the poll now. All right. And are you able to see when I share the results? Can you all see it? Yeah, thumbs up. Okay, great. Yeah, so as you can see, the most important duty according to this group is voting. And love civic education coming in second. You know, that's part of this program, so I think that's great. And the least important duty is by an overwhelming majority is acts of patriotism, displaying the flag and pledge. So that's the first time actually that we've put this in the poll. Other groups haven't really come up with it, so I think that's really interesting. Typically, what the vote is either military service or jury duty. So it's really good to have sort of the creativity from this group and thinking about those issues. So thank you so much. That concludes summer session 3. Couple items I just wanted to say before we go on. This is not the last you'll hear of us. We are going to be involved as much as we can with your schools to help with your practices. We'll also be putting on a testimony writing workshop once you're a little bit more into the year and you've been assigned units. We will be sending out information to your teachers about the Discord to the extent your schools permit it, or we'll be sending a list of our emails to reach out to if your school doesn't use Discord. If your school does use Discord, we ask that you actually use Discord to communicate with us so that we're only getting emails from the schools that don't allow it. I'll include all this information with your teachers as well. And as I mentioned before, we'll be sending out a list of sources that we typically use to your teachers and to all the emails who registered, so that you can know good places to get information. And that includes all the podcasts that I mentioned today. There's gonna be lots more podcasts on there because I love podcasts, as well as sources for some of the other information based off of the types of evidence presentation that Elise put on. Lastly, just a reminder, all 3 summer sessions are going to be posted on our YouTube channel. So if you ever want to go back to rehear some of the lectures or discussions we talked about, you can always do that. And all the summer session materials will stay as an open link, so you can go back to them in case they're helpful to you as well. So thank you all for your time, and I hope you enjoy the rest of your Sunday.